Hey everyone, Happy New Year, and we want to say Happy New Year and welcome to the very first Radiotopia Presents of 2024. It's a series that we are truly excited about. It's called Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. Now, this is from documentarian Jess Shane, who put out an open call on Craigslist and then worked with 4 strangers to explore the standard rules that documentarians and journalists use to tell their subject stories. So the series gets into all sorts of questions about what happens when people's real lives are collected, edited, and consumed. The show pulls back the curtain on what goes on behind the scenes of your favorite nonfiction shows. And then it turns in on itself and some really interesting twists and turns along the way in the making of the show. I've gotten to know Jess a little bit over the making of this show. Every time I chat with her, there's a new wrinkle to this story. It is really incredible. So go check out the new Radiotopia Presents series, Shocking, Heartbreaking, Transformative. It is out now on your favorite podcast platform. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Now, remember a couple episodes ago when the voting age kind of randomly came up and we said, we should find a time to do an episode on the voting age. Well, that time is now. It happened really fast. We are doing that episode because on this day, July 1st, 1971, North Carolina became the 38th state to ratify the adoption of the 26th Amendment, which lowered the national voting age to 18 from 75, believe it or not. No, from 21 to 18. But a big change, just a few years, but a big change affecting hundreds of thousands of Americans, kind of redefining when you get to call yourself an adult who can do adult things like vote. And it changed in many ways American democracy. And it was also, we will note, one of the last times our Constitution was amended, something we don't really do much anymore, as we will discuss. And here to discuss are, as always, Nicole Heimer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So I will just say in general, this is one of those instances of how a norm can change. You grew up just half a generation later and you don't really realize your parents and certainly your grandparents grew up with this notion that when you're 18, you don't vote. I mean, it's just sort of an interesting reminder. This is not that long ago that there was this big fight to change the voting age. But Kellie, take us to that fight. How did this come about and why did it come about, culminating in 1971?
Yeah, sure. So this is sort of a long, ongoing, if you will, process. If you think about the discussion or the activism created around lowering the vote to 18, it really starts with FDR. FDR called for this in World War II, saying that essentially if you are old enough to fight for this country, you should be old enough to vote for this country. President Eisenhower also picks up those same ideas and echoes them in a speech he gives in which he talks about the importance of lowering the voting age to 18. And this is something that varied from state to state. So there are certain states that started to lower the voting age to 18 or lower it for certain local or municipal elections. But this was a conversation and really a controversy because people were conflicted over whether or not 18-year-olds were capable of making these political decisions or would be invested enough to know about who was running and why their platforms mattered. So we see in the 1970s this really coming to a head, essentially with the Voting Rights Act that said, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to lower the vote so that all adults who reach the age of 18 will have accessibility to be able to vote in national, state, and local elections. And this was such a game changer because many people were, conflicted over whether or not 18-year-olds would be mature enough to cast a ballot in this way. And that's something that I think is still being debated today. Should we lower it? Should we lower it to 16? Are 16-year-olds or teenagers capable of thinking about politics in this way?
I think that starting with Eisenhower is a really good point because there is a through line that runs from the 40s and 50s through 1971 when this is finally turned into an amendment and ratified. And that is linking the idea of being old enough to vote with being old enough to fight. And Eisenhower, of course, was a general in World War II, and he was somebody who commanded troops that included young men who were 18 years old and who were dying on the battlefields and yet would come home and didn't have the right to vote. And of course, much older men, black men who he had under his command, wouldn't have been able to exercise the right to vote if they were in the South. And so there is this linkage in the argument. If you're old enough to die for your country, you're old enough to vote. And that's important when it comes back up again in the late 60s and 70s because of the Vietnam War.
Right. It's
so contentious, the draft. And to have all of these young men and women who are activists in the 1960s opposing the war, but not having a say in who their government is, becomes, again, a pretty contentious issue.
Yeah, you track the history of this. It's not surprising that it pops up during wartime because of that argument. And, just the sort of underlying argument there is if you're going to fight for your country, maybe you should have a say in the policies and the elected leaders who take you to those fights and take you to war. I have always found that saying, if you're old enough to fight, you should be old enough to vote, to be very compelling. I find it very compelling, but I've also found it a little weird that it's an argument that leads you to then talk about voting rights and the age, as opposed to maybe asking some questions about the age of people that we send to war.
Right.
It's like that turn of phrase never ends up launching a conversation about war. It always ends up being used to launch a conversation about voting.
Well, and it has real limits in terms of who it imagines is the ideal citizen, right? Yeah. If you're talking about this in the 1940s, or even in the 1960s, there aren't women on the front lines. And so when they're the sort of imagined citizen who's being fought for and lowering the voting age tends to be men.
Yeah. And I also think that, we've kind of extended childhood in a lot of ways, and that, over 100 years ago, if you were 18, you might likely be married with a child on the way. So the ways that we think about adulthood or how people enter adulthood have changed drastically as well.
Yeah. So we're having and we'll circle back to these sort of questions about adulthood and agency and sort of the ability to have a say. Those are the very high-minded conversations that swirl around this. You do track the history of this, and it often doesn't feel very high-minded. It often feels a little petty and procedural and so forth, especially around the early 70s, because there is this interesting moment, Kellie, you referred to it, where the Voting Rights Act gets passed. It advocates for lowering the age. At a federal level, the age does kind of get lowered, but then at the state level, it doesn't. And so this ends up being a tension between states' rights and federal policy, and just a discrepancy for a while where it seemed like there were different laws depending on where you lived and depending on what kind of election you were voting in.
This is the challenge with federal voting right laws, is that we have really decentered electoral processes. They're not just at the state level, but they're at the local level as well. And in this case, you could pass a law that said that the voting age for federal elections was at 18, but you might be in a place like, let's say, Texas, and the voting rights for state elections were 20 or 21. And so they would actually have to keep two different sets of voter rolls in order to make that work, in order to have higher restrictions on voting for state and local elections than what they have for federal elections. And a lot of states argued that that was really onerous, right? It was like a tax being put on the states because they needed to kind of double their election machinery. And this was often done in states' rights language. I mean, one of the big opponents of the 26th Amendment was someone named James J. Kilpatrick, who was a journalist and a writer and also one of the foremost advocates of segregation in the early 1960s. And so he transfers that states' rights language from segregation and opposition to black voting rights to opposition to voting rights for people the age of 18.
And is he making that on a states' rights basis, or is he just kind of at some fundamental level opposed to the expansion of voting rights?
I mean, he wasn't super pro-democracy, but his argument was that states were being extorted by the federal government. And so it really fits into this broader politics of defending segregation, defending all sorts of things under the banner of states' rights. So it's a theory of government in addition to a theory of exclusion.
I think it's also interesting, too, when we think about race and age and how this plays out, because you really needed, as NIki was saying, like a consensus across the country. You needed a streamlined way of making sure that everyone sort of had the same guidelines or rules. But also, I think there's controversy because people didn't know how young people were going to vote. And if they thought that young people were going to lean liberal or lean to the left, then there was a real push to say, I don't know that we should lower this particular age. And I think the same thing happens with African-American voters as well. Oh, if they're going to lean left, then there's always a movement to disenfranchise people. So, and you see a lot of these battles still playing out today when Ayanna Pressley proposed lowering the voting age to 16. She got tremendous pushback, a lot within the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party as well.
Well, it also makes me think of like DC statehood, for instance, right, where that doesn't get talked about on the pro-democracy terms. It gets talked about in partisan terms, and what is going to be the actual effect of this. And that's a really good point.
Well, there's a couple of important developments there, right? Because when the parties are sorted by ideology, which is something that happens a little after this point, then it becomes a partisan issue. In this case, you can have liberal Republicans supporting more liberal legislation and liberal Democrats. But also, this idea of broad-based support. You need really broad-based support in order to pass an amendment. The requirements are onerous: 2/3 of the Congress, 3/4 of the states. So there was a real public relations battle that had to be won in the years before this in order to get this constitutional amendment through and get it through as fast as they did.
Yeah, and so to tie up that story, right, it does get ratified 3/4 of the states. The day we are marking today is when North Carolina goes over that tipping point. It does seem like, to go back to this, tension between the practical and the idealistic, that at some level a lot of the states ratified it just because they were like, it's really annoying to have 2 voter rolls. It's sort of a pain. Okay, let's just codify this and we'll just go along. And obviously there was a groundswell, but never underestimate the power of like, I want to make my life a little easier in terms of how people make decisions. Yeah.
I just think it's remarkable, like the vote, the swiftness with which it went through legislation, to me is incredible. On March 10th, the Senate voted 94-0 for the amendment, and the House goes along 13 days later, 401-19. So when you think about the overwhelming support, I mean, we can never get those numbers again, but or that sort of consensus again.
And then it's under 2 months before all this, before 3/4 of the states come on board. Yeah. Yeah.
Record time for a constitutional amendment. That is record time.
So on constitutional amendments, a couple things. So one, yes, that's record time. We've talked about constitutional amendments a couple times on the show, but I love the notion that it is stuff that happens without the president. We think of the president as so important now, and I love the idea that this can happen. And, the way that this actually, North Carolina, they were the deciders, and then it gets certified not by the president, it gets certified by the administrator of general services. So a man named Robert Kunzing was the actual person who sort of made this a law. And Nixon, I think, got invited to the ceremony. But again, it's just, I love the notion that it doesn't run through the president when we are so obsessed with him. We think of the president as all powerful in this way. The other thing it brings up whenever we talk about amendments is, this is the second to last time our amendment has been tweaked. The most recent one was, I believe, 1992, even more esoteric than this. It was something about changing the way in which senators get paid. I mean, very small. And also, I was reading that one, we could do an episode on this, but I was reading that one, it had previously been ratified in when they first wrote the Constitution, or it previously been amended, right after they first wrote the Constitution. So there was this 220-year gap between tweaking that amendment, which I think is the longest one. But we do not.
There's still hope for the ERA.
Exactly. Right. And so the ERA, now is over 30 years. It's been mired and in limbo. But a reminder that we used to amend our Constitution fairly regularly, and we have not touched it in a long, long time.
And it is very difficult to imagine the kind of overwhelming public support that isn't thwarted by partisanship in the Congress in order to make something like this happen. So it could happen. History unfolds in unexpected ways, but I would not anticipate a big raft of constitutional amendments anytime soon.
Yeah.
We should also note that the first election in which young people from 18 to 20 had the right to vote, Richard Nixon won in a landslide. Like, whatever that youth vote was supposed to look like in an era of hippies and
they were not
activism.
rocking the votes.
Yeah.
We needed MTV to come along to really organize that.
And, it is true that, like, voting numbers among young people are really bad, and they were okay in those first few years, and they've steadily gone down, other than 2008, where I think it was around 50% for 18 to 21, but generally it's very, very low, as it is across the board. And there's all sorts of questions around there. I think it's a difference between giving someone a vote and making them feel like their vote counts. There's a big gap between those two things, and I think this highlights that. I'm curious, as we wrap up, if you have thoughts about just the voting age and these questions of adulthood and when you get to have a say. I mean, 18 around the world is sort of the standard. It's interesting how consistently that seems to have been adopted. There are some
in South Korea,
right?
19.
Yeah, South Korea is 19. What is it? The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is 25 or older. There are some places where it's 16: Nicaragua, Scotland, Ethiopia, Ecuador, Cuba, Brazil, Austria. A couple jurisdictions in the United States, like Berkeley, California, and some cities in Maryland, have allowed 16-year-olds. We're not an opinion podcast, but do you have thoughts on this? Where would you put this age?
I mean, I am not opposed to hearing arguments about 16 and 17-year-olds voting. 18 seems like a pretty natural point. It's when a lot of other rights begin to adhere to citizens in the U.S. So, it seems fine where it is. I think that we haven't yet found the powerful, emotional, popular argument that will persuade a large number of voters to lower it to 16. But I would count myself as among those very open to the idea.
Yeah, I'm open to it too. I think, I don't know, at 16 I could drive. So I think that I don't know if that law plays out across the board at what age people can drive, but like
it really varies.
For me, I was very engaged, but I also had parents who were very active and very committed to voting and teaching me about that. So I do think that it depends on your family situation, how voting gets taught or presented to you, the importance of it. But yeah, sure, why not? I'm open to 16.
There you go. Okay, there's an endorsement. Let the groundswell begin. When 20 years from now, when someone is doing a podcast like this, they will talk about this episode as the small esoteric moment that led to the groundswell.
You're welcome.
You're welcome, future. But no, I think I agree with you. I mean, I think about look, we are affected by policy and the choices that our politicians make from the moment we're born, and so there's at some level there's an argument that you should have a say, whenever you can. But I do think that at some point younger than 18, it feels to me like you both start to understand how the world works and start to see it, and are also really, if you think about education and criminal justice, for instance, two of the big issues, you are affected by policy decisions and those fronts far younger than 18, and so it's just where is it that confluence of, well, this is affecting me and I have a little bit of enough maturity to have a say and sort of process how my lived experience and make a decision as a result. But yeah, I think somewhere in that 15 to 18 range is where it happens. Anyway, there we go. Okay, let's end the episode. That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. You can get in touch with us with any questions or comments or ideas for the show. Email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Now, the custom on certification of an amendment has varied through the history of this country, but I understand a president has a prerogative to ask for additional witnesses if he likes. And on this occasion, therefore, I'm going to ask that 3 of the representatives of this group, who are 18 years of age. I'm going to present the pen that I witnessed with to the director. I wish we had 500 more pens, but that's above our budget.
Radiotopia.